give you some context to why is this, why has this come in? We're going to look at what is unlawful under these changes, and then spend some time on the guidelines that have been developed by the Australian Human Rights Commission to provide guidance to businesses on the steps that they expected to take and how they can put practices in place to prevent sexual harassment from occurring in the workplace. And the second part of the presentation is focusing on psychosocial safety. So we're then looking at work health and safety legislation and new regulations in particular dealing with psychosocial safety. And these regulations are coming in here in South Australia on the 28th of December, while other states have progressively adopted these regulations. They are model regulations, which applies in all states that have adopted the model WHS legislation. So states like New South Wales, Queensland, Tasmania, so on and so forth. So we then, pardon me, we will then look at what the psychosocial hazards are, what the definitions are, looking at work-related stress, why businesses should take an interest in this, why it matters, not just in terms of compliance, but in terms of business activities and impact. And then spending some time on what businesses can do, and then talk about resources. Before we get into sort of in detail the positive duty, obviously, I mean, as I said, the driver for this webinar is the recent changes that we have seen in terms of sexual harassment and the requirement for businesses to take active steps in preventing sexual harassment and psychosocial harm to employees. And so we obviously have a compliance element. We want to get it right because of potential cost and reputational damage if we don't. And of course, it's a HR element. We want to ensure that everyone who comes to work feels safe and respected and feel that they can contribute productively to the workplace. But I think it's also important to take a broader look and look at the sort of ESG framework, the environment, social, and governance framework. So to broaden the conversation. So as many of you would be aware, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and it represents a framework which has been used to evaluate companies' performance and sustainability. And over time, and increasingly so, it has gained significant importance in the business world as investors, stakeholders, and consumers consider non-financial factors of businesses when making decisions. That can be big decisions whether to invest in a company or purchase products, particularly large retailers in markets overseas require evidence that businesses are managing the ESG framework and maybe asking specific questions on not just in terms of compliance, but also in terms of practices. So clearly, if we look at sexual harassment, if there are instances where I guess businesses are reporting sexual harassment, or there might be court cases involving a business in terms of sexual harassment. Well, clearly there are costs, there are HR aspects to it, but also direct business costs. It might be retailers, it might be importers, it might be customers, whether in Australia or overseas, who may find that offensive and may say, well, if that's the way the business is managing or not managing ESG, then we need to take into account if purchasing your product. And equally in terms of psychosocial harm, there might be questions before you supply or before you export, asking for evidence what businesses are doing in terms of the working environment, not just sort of the physical working environment, but the sort of the psychological working environment too. So it's becoming increasingly a market access issue. That's recognized by Wine Australia too. In order to gain access to certain markets, we need to show our ESG credentials. So I think it's important to take that into account when looking at these changes today. So in other words, it's not just a HR or a WHS issue, it actually is a strategic issue to manage going forward. So looking at the positive duty, so in summary, what we are looking at today is establishing systems for prevention, management, and reporting when it comes to sexual harassment. And the president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, which is responsible for enforcing the positive duty and provide guidance around that, said that Australia as a country, we must begin to actively prevent sexual harassment and sex discrimination rather than simply responding to when it happens and addressing it afterwards. So that's really like the background to the positive duty. So it comes from, the basis is from the Respect at Work inquiry. So in June 2018, against the backdrop of the Me Too movement and the recognition of prevalence of sex harassment and the harm it causes in Australia and overseas in workplaces, then Sex Discrimination Commissioner and the responsible minister announced a national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australia. And they undertook a national survey which found that almost 2 in 5 women, so 39%, and just 1 over 4 men, so 26%, had experienced workplace sexual harassment in the last 5 years. So a really high figure. And one of the key findings of this report was that sexual harassment is still common in workplaces, particularly in relation to women and minorities. So whether that's migrant workers, LGBT workers, workers with a disability were overrepresented when it comes to experiencing sexual harassment. And also finding that the system that had been around for a long time, which was primarily complaints-driven, complaints-based, it placed too much onus and burden on the victims to address it. And too little was done up front to ensure that steps were taken to prevent it in the first place. And also in terms of the duty on employers, the inquiry found that in their view, employers only needed to really demonstrate action once something had occurred. So they were only asked sort of post the incident, what did you do, as opposed to having to demonstrate upfront what they were doing. So I guess, comparing that to safety, it's a bit like saying that, we don't need SOPs or risk assessments until someone gets injured. So looking at the positive duty, it basically looks more and more like safety. So in other words, we are required to proactively address safety, to do risk assessments and have prevention in place going forward to avoid accidents occurring. And equally with a positive duty, there is no expectation that we take a number of steps proactively to stop it from occurring. So shifting from reactive to proactive and then driving cultural change, that is really what the positive duty obligation is about. So what does the positive duty actually say? Well, it's now under law a requirement for businesses to take reasonable and proportionate measures to eliminate as far as possible. So you can see the language, it sounds very much like safety. To eliminate as far as possible discrimination on the grounds of sex, sexual harassment, sex-based harassment, to eliminating so-called hostile work environments on the grounds of sex, and also victimization. So we've highlighted the term reasonable and proportionate because they are key terms. And what that is saying is that what's reasonable and what's proportionate, well, it's basically how a business is addressing this and what the steps they're taking depends. It depends on the business. So in other words, what may be reasonable for a smaller business might not be reasonable for a larger business. A larger business generally would be expected to do more. Why? Because generally larger businesses have greater resources, have a greater workforce, might have a workforce spread over multiple sites, might have a workforce spread over multiple states, may not necessarily have, I guess, the direct visibility that a smaller business, a family-owned business may have, and got greater complexity. And equally, depending on the industry or the workplace, a workplace which is male dominated would be expected to do more than a workplace where it's more equal representation when it comes to the genders, for example. Also looking at, reasonableness is effectiveness versus costs. That's always a key consideration. Not that one can say that, well, I'm not going to take any steps because it's too expensive, but in selecting what steps to take, reasonableness includes and proportionate includes the cost aspect. What's more effective. And also looking at, in terms of reasonableness, asking yourself, are the resources that have been allocated, are they sufficient to prevent this? So obviously the response will be different from business to business, but a key point I will make, and I will get to that further in the slides, that in the guidelines that have been issued by the Australian Human Rights Commission, they have published the so-called 7 standards, and they are 7 standards that all businesses must consider. So in addressing the positive duty, there are 7 standards that all businesses, regardless of size, regardless of ownership, regardless of industry, they have to address. How they address it, that will depend. What specific controls they will implement, that will depend. But the base expectation is very much the same. So sort of the key terms that were addressed in the previous slide. So in terms of discrimination on sex. So I'm going to run through the definitions, but because that's important to keep in mind. So discrimination on the grounds of sex is basically treating someone less favorable because of the gender, because of the sex. Sexual harassment is conduct of a sexual nature, where someone, sort of a reasonable person, would anticipate that the recipient or the other person would be offended, humiliated, or intimidated. So a key aspect of sexual harassment is not the intent; it's actually how another person perceives it, and we have seen that in action in court cases and so on, where the sort of alleged perpetrator said, well, I didn't intend, or I was just joking. This hasn't changed, but it's just important to reinforce that it's actually not what you intended, but how it was perceived. Sex-based harassment could include sexist or sort of demeaning language. It could, asking women in workplace to, make me a coffee, or and not that making coffee is part of the role, but basically implying that someone, because of the gender, because of the sex, are expected to do things that that men aren't expected to do, or commentary like man up, don't be sensitive, and so on and so forth, addressed to men, for example. The hostile work environment, that is a key change that wasn't previously covered in legislation. And what that means is it's basically conduct which is not addressed to a particular person. So even though it's not addressed to a particular person, may not be, like, it's not necessarily harassment because it's not sort of a single victim, so to speak, but it's conduct which is hostile and intimidating to people of a particular sex or gender. So that could be nude calendars, it could be a general language which is being overheard, commentary, and so on. So basically, yeah, overall conduct which is makes people uncomfortable. And in terms of victimization, it's treating someone badly or unfairly because they have reported unlawful behavior. Also, just want to highlight quickly that obviously we focus on the Sex Discrimination Act, the Federal Sex Discrimination Act, but sexual harassment, sex discrimination, and these sort of type of acts and conduct may well trigger responses under a number of other laws, and that's a combination of state and federal laws. So one example is if someone is experiencing sexual harassment or sex discrimination at work, it's entirely reasonable that may result in injury, in a sort of psychosocial or mental type injury. And if you're suffering a sort of workplace injury, where where the work is the cause or predominant cause of the injury, then in our system, and that that is across sort of all states, all jurisdictions, that employees are entitled to lodge a claim, and that could be in SA we refer to that as return to work. In other states, maybe workers' compensation. We also have in the Fair Work Commission now a power for employees to apply for basically a stop order. So we have a stop order previously in terms of bullying. We now have a jurisdiction in terms of sexual harassment, where workers can go to the Fair Work Commission and seek orders against whether that's employers, whether that's managers or other employees, for them to stop doing certain things, and for employers to take certain steps. We also have state-based human rights commission, equal opportunity commissions. In South Australia, we've got the Equal Opportunity Commission. It's unlawful under state-based laws to engage in sexual harassment and sex discrimination. So a worker who is an employee who is experiencing this have a choice which jurisdiction they want to go to. They can make a claim in the state or territory, or they can make a claim in the Commonwealth body. And also, we know that exposing employees to hostile work environments, to sex discrimination, sexual harassment, and the like, exposes employee to an injury. So that may well trigger a response under workplace safety law. In SA, and here in South Australia, it's Safe Work SA. In other states, it could be Work Safe or whatever that's called. So you can see that this is an area where, if something goes wrong, then there are a number of avenues that employees can address this, and where that may trigger a response from regulatory agencies. We're now going to spend some time on the guidelines. So these are guidelines which have been issued by the Australian Human Rights Commission, and they have been issued to assist businesses in addressing the depositor duty. So they provide extensive guidance. They are about 80+ pages long, and really guidance on how to comply with depositor duty. And I did refer to, in my previous slides, the 7 standards. So the guidelines set out what the 7 standards are, and what the Commission expects of businesses when it comes to taking steps to prevent this. They're not legally binding, but they set out a number of steps. And when addressing compliance, this is what the Commission is going to look like. Sorry, going to look at. They're going to look at what the business is doing. So what the business has done. So it's not a checklist. You don't have to do exactly what's being set out, but there's some practical guidance in the guidelines, and it also sets out slightly different responses depending on the size of the business. So there's sections which says that a small business may look at this in particular, or these following steps may be mainly relevant for large businesses. So as you can see from the slides, the first standard deals with leadership, and what that really is about is for leaders, for management to understand obligations, verifying, ensuring that there are procedures and processes in place to proactively prevent sexual harassment from occurring. The tone from the top, and also being visible and supportive. So in a practical sense, what does that mean? Well, it's about management being aware, being across the obligations. So if you haven't done that internally in your workplace, a recommendation would be that the management team should have a session on what is expected of them, because they are the one tasked with, I guess, providing insurance and verifying that there are processes in place, as they are in terms of safety. And that could be ensuring that there's a policy and procedure in place, checking that measures have been implemented, having statements from senior management on the importance of respectful behavior and that we don't expect harassment, That could be in staff inductions, in staff meetings. It could be on posters and messages, and ensuring that appropriate action are being taken against people who engage in unlawful behavior. And also important that with all these steps throughout the guidelines, there is an expectation that there is evidence of steps being taken, similarly to safety. You know, it wouldn't be good enough to say, well, we've done it, but if we can't show any documentation, we can't show that staff have gone through training, we can't show there's a policy in place, we can't show that it's ever been discussed on a management level or indeed on the board level, that wouldn't help. And recently, the Australian Institute of Company Directors ran a session specifically looking at board directors, what is expected of board directors in ensuring that the positive duty is being complied with and those steps are implemented in the business. So looking at culture, culture is clearly a key aspect, similar to safety. So it's really about fostering a culture that is safe, respectful, and inclusive, that employees are empowered to report instances, and also that everyone knows that people are going to be held to account for their actions. And how can you support and foster a culture? Well, firstly, good idea to be aware of gender composition and diversity in the workplace. Supporting and participating in diversity and inclusion initiatives, and that could be workplace initiatives, can be supporting employees to attend external training or events. You know, usually on International Women's Day, the number of activities, it could be, you know, business having their own events, or supporting employees to attend. Encouraging employees to call out disrespectful behavior. And that's also not just sort of calling out disrespectful behavior from an employee to an employee, but also thinking about what are we doing if customers or say contractors engage in behavior which is disrespectful or unlawful. Are we going to deal with that? If we've got customers in the cellar door speaking to a cellar worker in a disrespectful or potentially, you know, harassing someone, what are we going to do? And that may be tricky. I respect that. I respect and understand that, but that's something that I would encourage you to have a look at, not just look at how are sort of workers engaging between themselves, but also what are we doing in terms of contractors and customers. And that's not in the cellar door. It could be if you do telesales, you may have a call center, you might have a wine club, and you're calling members, and it could occur over the phone too. So what support, you know, and what systems do you have in place for employees to voice that, either to call it out and also report it to management. Moving on to knowledge. So developing, communicating, and implementing policy and respectful behavior and unlawful conduct. Ensuring that staff are aware of that. Provide education. I would suggest that simply having a policy which sits sort of in a folder somewhere will not be enough. There is an expectation to do more. So specifically investors in staff inductions, training to managers, could be toolbox talks, and so on and so forth. And also have a way of periodically, I guess, refresh it. It could be, you know, maybe, you know, once a year, every 6 months, that you have some activity. You have a newsletter to staff, for example. Include, you know, communications around that. Risk management. So a recognition of the risk that sexual harassment poses, and take a risk-based approach. So incorporate it into the WHS framework, and consider sexual harassment when reviewing documentation. Consult with staff on the risks. So obviously speak to staff who are, you know, who would be a bit closest to the issue, as you would do with safety. So undertaking risk assessments, and then use that risk assessment to develop appropriate controls. In terms of support, this is a sort of a key message throughout the guidelines, that not just have reporting mechanisms, but ensuring that in the event that staff are reporting harassment, inappropriate conduct, have support measures in place. So really look at the well-being and safety of those employees. So look, thinking of like, who will they turn to for support, not just to report it, but who will they turn for support? Do we have staff, whether it's HR or the WHS manager in the business, or a senior manager who can provide that support to them? Do we have an employee assistance program? Do we have a contact we can turn to, because this could be highly traumatic? So what can we do? And also, as I mentioned in the guidelines, the well-being of the person, that is paramount. So before you jump into, let's start an investigation, let's take witness statements, let's suspend, or let's do this and that. Look at the safety first, because that was also finding in the review that there was, there were processes in place and they were highly formalized, but the care and the well-being of the person, of the complainant, was lacking in many cases. Reporting and response, so having clear reporting mechanisms that are known to staff, they're clearly communicated. There are multiple ways of reporting, so not just sort of internally, and that's, you want to get issues raised with you, but also recognizing that under law, there are a number of bodies that employees are entitled to make complaints to. And we can't say, don't go externally, talk to us only. No, clearly it's probably more successful trying to address an issue internally first. But workers, employees have the capacity to go to the Fair Work Commission, for example, to the Australian Human Rights Commission, to the Equal Opportunity Commission in SA, to Safe Work, having safe and confidential reporting mechanisms. So ensuring that people know who to turn to if they want to report. And then monitoring, evaluation, and transparency. This is also a key message. So having ways to collect data to understand the nature and extent of any unlawful conduct. And not be solely complaints driven, because it's easy to think that, well, we haven't had any complaints, we haven't had any issues. Well, how do we know? Because we also know that sexual harassment generally is severely underreported, because it's uncomfortable, it can be traumatic, it can be embarrassing. If you're making a complaint against maybe another manager, maybe against another employee, or say a contract is coming on site. So also asking yourself, how do we know what the culture is? Have we done a staff survey? Have we spoken to employees? What data do we have? And how can we use that to improve work culture? So that's the, in a nutshell, very quickly, the 7 standards. Due to time, I won't be able to spend much more on the depository duty, because we have a second part of the webinar to get through. But I would very much encourage you to download the guidelines for complying with depository duty on sex discrimination. You can always get in touch with us if you want to get a copy too. And they are very practical. They might look daunting because they're very extensive, but it signifies the extent to which Human Rights Commission expects businesses to go to prevent it. And you may well find that you have a number of practices in place already. It doesn't mean that you have to reinvent the wheel or develop all these new resources. Having said that, if someone sort of works through the list and says, well, we don't have to do anything because we've got it all in place, or we think it's enough with sort of just one of them, I would suggest that probably wouldn't be sufficient. So next steps will be work through, familiarize yourself with the guidelines, have a discussion with the management team on next steps to take, review your policies and procedures, review the training and inductions we provide to staff. So, particularly of a vintage, are we focusing primarily on physical safety, on dragging hoses and not, cutting yourself and not being hit, not being been hit by moving vehicles and so on? Clearly, key safety issues, but this is an additional sort of safety issue to manage. Look at, how management addresses this board reporting. Are the ways for the board to be aware of serious instances? But also, as a member of SAWIA, please feel free to reach out. We are very happy to come out on site and give presentations to workers on a broad range of topics, whether that's respectable workforce, respectable sort of behavior in the workforce generally. So looking at cross discrimination and harassment and bullying, because they sort of tend to intersect. We'll do a session on the management team. We can do webinars. So if you just want to get some advice, always happy to have a chat to you. So please reach out. Moving on to the second part of the presentation, the psychosocial safety. So in summary, this is about managing the risks and hazards of job-related stresses. And I mentioned that there are changes that are coming in on the 28th of December. But in addition, looking at the DSG framework, there is a need to manage this as well. But also looking at, I guess, the business aspect of it. So why should you take an interest apart from compliance? Well, it's very costly. It's been estimated by Safe Work Australia that per year in compensation for work-related mental health conditions, businesses are paying, experiencing $904 million per year. We also know that claims, so return to work claims, or if you call it workers' compensation claims, they're costly. So the average cost of all injuries for looking at an employer for a particular injury is close to $16,000 per year. That's the average cost, and the average time lost is 8 weeks. If you look at mental health claims, the average cost is $58,600, so almost $59,000. Number of weeks, it's not 8, it's not 18, it's not 28. The average weeks lost due to mental health claims is 34 weeks. So you can see the immense business cost of mental health claims. In addition to that, we've got the cost of lower productivity, the turnover cost, the recruitment cost, the training costs. Immense impact. And if employees are experiencing a work environment where they don't feel supported, where they are experiencing stresses, which may, then in turn trigger particular mental health conditions, well, more likely to be absent from work, more turnover, when being present, being less productive, less efficient. So what are psychosocial hazards? Well, it is very broad. So psychosocial hazards are basically hazards that cause psychological and can cause physical harm via work-related stress. So it could relate to the design and management of work, so the organizational structure, reporting line, the working environment, could be working in isolation, for example, the plant, at the workplace, the interaction and behavior, so interaction with other colleagues, for example. And in terms of psychosocial harm, very broad, conditions like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, sleep disorders. It's a number of conditions that can be caused by psychosocial hazards. And what can cause work-related stress? So high-pressure work environment where staff are feeling that there's never enough time to get things done, and always have to work late, a lot of overtime, poor work-life balance, not feeling that they can combine work with family life, for example, with caring responsibilities, unclear job expectations and not understanding who's responsible for what. Being very uncertain whether whether they are responsible or someone else, feeling that they get criticized for not doing the work when they didn't even know it was the responsibility. Bullying and harassment is, it's pretty obvious that they can give rise to work-related stress. Lack of recognition, so feeling that they never get recognized for the work they've done, and that's very broad. That could be lack of training opportunities, a sense that, who would want to be paid a higher salary, but that's not really what it's about. It's more about maybe never ever feeling that being recognized, being receiving a thank you for doing a good job, that we don't call out good behavior, we're only focusing on poor behavior. So poor communication with management, for example, poorly managed organizational changes, so restructures and redundancies, and not understanding the reasons, not understanding why people are being selected just one day, noticing that a colleague is gone. It could be discrimination, feeling that, or a sense that, whether that's gender or sexuality or nationality, or whatever the age, whatever that may be, a sense that you're not getting the same opportunities as others because a particular characteristic applying to you. Excessive workload, lack of control, and not being able to really influence the work, inadequate training and development. So really stress is the body's reaction when a worker perceives that the demands of the work exceed their ability or resources to cope. So it's not an injury in itself, but if it becomes frequent, prolonged or severe, it can cause psychological or physical harm. And also, sort of these factors on their own may not cause harm, but if they are so severe, they may. And when there's a mixture of multiple sort of issues, then that is more likely to cause harm. So in South Australia, we now have regulations which have been issued in relation to psychosocial risks. And in SA, the regulations are referred to as the Work Health and Safety Regulations. Sorry, Work Health and Safety bracket Psychosocial Risks Amendment Regulations 2023. And they are made under the Work Health and Safety Act here in South Australia. And as I said, other states have already implemented this, and the requirements are the same because they are model, they are harmonized regulations, and they're also harmonized in most states. So in short, they are saying that a business undertaking a PCBU, they must manage psychosocial risks. It doesn't mean that businesses previously weren't required to. Safety, and when we talk about risks and hazards and safety has never been limited to physical safety. The psychosocial aspect of it has always been present. The reason why we are getting specific regulations and a code of practice is that there was a review of the safety laws, the model safety laws, a couple of years ago, and feedback from a number of entities, a number of bodies, was that there was insufficient guidance to PCBUs on how they should manage this. There was a recognition that more employees are experiencing mental health conditions. Obviously, we had the cost impact that was recognized, and we had to do better. We had to look at this sort of more specifically on how to create workplaces where we are better managing our psychosocial risks. So it outlines that in determining the control measures, so the PCBU must have regard to all relevant matters, including, so this list is not exhaustive. So look at the duration and frequency and severity of the exposure, looking at the design of work, so job demands and tasks, looking at systems of work, so how work is managed. And that could be reporting line, organizational structure, what support, the level of supervision and management, design and layout of environmental conditions of the workplace. So safe means of entering and exiting the workplace facilities, in other words, lunchrooms, places of rest, could be looking at, whether people are working in isolation, for example, interactions. So understanding what the culture is, how people speak to each other in the workplace, colleagues to colleagues, but also whether employees are suffering maybe abuse from customers. What type of instruction, training, and supervision we provide to workers. So they are some of the factors that have to be taken into account when we are determining the control measures. So on the next sort of couple of slides, we're going to give you a couple of examples of psychosocial hazards to put into context. To give examples of what they could be. So clearly they are fictitious companies. I don't think these businesses, we hope they don't exist in terms of name. We try to be somewhat creative. But really to put it into context to show you what it could look like. So the first example, this is an example dealing with high job demands. In this instance, Claire is being on hand. She works long and irregular hours, and sometimes does so without the break. She feels sort of inadequate. She feels often that she hasn't fully recovered before she's back at work. She's constantly aware of the pressure to work faster, and would compare herself against a machine. So this is a hazard. Job high demands is a hazard. If you constantly feel stressed, well, it's a stressor, and that in turn can give rise to an injury, to harm. So what could the controls be like? What could they look like? So looking at scheduling, can you schedule the task in a way to avoid sort of long, sustained high demand periods? Is it a lack of staff in a particular work area? Is it about working processes? Is it that work is too manual? Can we use equipment and machinery, for example? Can we provide appropriate breaks for rest? Can we schedule time off? Is there a way for this particular worker to escalate the problems? So if she is experiencing all this pressure, how can she report that? And what support is she getting from managers if she reports that? So just an example of a hazard and potentially what a control could look like. And obviously the controls will depend. It will depend. It will depend on the workplace. It will depend on the size. It will depend on the resources. But clearly, if this is being identified, a control would have to be identified and implemented. Another hazard is poor organizational justice. So in this case, Craig is a leading seller hand, doesn't get along with his manager, and last week his manager criticized him for taking sick leave, and that was done in the toolbox talks. Others were present. He doesn't feel like he can raise problems. He feels they're always given the worst shifts. He's not given the same opportunities as other employees are. And there's really no way for him to report this. So a sense that he's being treated unfairly to others, he's not given the same opportunities. So what could controls be? Well, looking at ways to report this, to raise issues or concerns, to seek support from management. Ensuring that when we are allocating shifts, for example, or when we are allocating training, look at how we do that, and also think of perception of decisions, because in the end, poor organizational justice, it's also about perception, and perception is reality. So how are we communicating decisions? Why is it that he perceives that he always gets the worst shifts? Is it due to a lack of staff? And how long has this been going on for example? So there's sort of multiple ways to consider controls. Lack of role clarity. So Mark is a vineyard manager, feels that his role is constantly changing, not really understanding what he is responsible for. Never completely clear who he should report to. He might have multiple managers. He might be in a matrix structure where, he's got different managers who he has to report to. He's giving instructions, which might be conflicting. He doesn't always have a complete task information and just expected to, work things out on his own. Feeling that he's not set clear priorities, so multiple tasks, doesn't know really what's the most important thing to do at this point in time, and doesn't really have anyone to race it with. So obviously it can cause a lot of stress. And how can we address that? Address this. So working with HR, so looking at position descriptions, which outlines key tasks, responsibilities, designing a management structure, an organizational structure with clear reporting line. People know who they can actually turn to for direction to assist setting and prioritizing tasks, checking in with workers on how they are doing, encourage open discussions among team members, having a feedback system where employees receive feedback and can seek clarity on their role. So throughout sort of all these controls, and I think this is what makes, I guess, the psychosocial risk management quite different from sort of safety more broadly, is that this is an area where safety, if it's talk about sort of traditional safety, we have a traditional safety manager, safety coordinator, we'd have to work very closely with HR, because these controls, and there's no disrespect to any safety professional, but these controls would have to be addressed sort of in an HR type of way. So looking at position descriptions, reporting line, organizational structure, workload, and so on. So not, I guess, in a traditional sense, safety, where we might be looking at, okay, can we have engineering controls, for example? I'm not saying that engineering controls may not be applicable, but I think you probably all understand what I'm trying to get, that this is an area where we have to work across, maybe traditional boundaries, traditional sort of units and departments to identify, but also to develop and implement controls. The last example I want to give is in relation to cellar door, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the cellar door, obviously. It can be it could be events. We do a lot of events in the wine industry. It could be, you might have a restaurant, you might have a cafe. So Viv is a cellar door supervisor, and the cellar door commonly accept buses in the afternoon. And when customers arrive, they may already have had a bit to drink, which is, from a liquor licensing perspective, potentially problematic. So Viv doesn't have any clear authorization to provide refunds and discounts, and she has to deal with staff, customers who are aggrieved, they want to get special deals, or they might be unhappy, and she's sometimes subject to verbal abuse. So Nia sort of no clear expectations on patrons for the conduct, and at times Viv is the only staff member in the cellar door. So it can be like hostile, aggressive behavior from customers. So what could we do in terms of controls? Well, making it clear to people in the cellar door that they do have the authority, they are empowered to call out inappropriate behavior, look at whether it's appropriate for staff members to work on their own. Might be setting policies that we don't accept buses. Some cellar doors don't. They require sort of pre-booking. Working with, for example, the transport provider, to have a policy in place that they have to monitor intoxication, empowering the cellar door manager to actually refuse service of alcohol, because that is also a requirement in the liquor licensing laws. If someone is really intoxicated, well, that's a problem if you keep on serving. Making it clear that as a manager you have the authority to make decisions if there are requests for refunds or discounts. Looking at rostering the appropriateness of working on their own, ensuring there are sort of escalation procedures in place, that if you are working on your own, or if you need guidance, that there's someone you can turn to. So yeah, we try to sort of cover off a number of different, potential hazards in different parts of the business. So in terms of psychosocial risks, there is an expectation to, eliminate the risks as far as reasonable practicable. So identifying hazards, so working, consulting with workers in identifying what the risks may be, have a clear sort of reporting mechanism, being aware of behaviors, being aware of data, doing for example, a staff survey, encourage reporting. And in terms of assessing the risks, look at the duration, frequency, and severity to help us prioritize what we should be doing. And also, as I mentioned previously, a single issue may not cause harm on their own, but obviously if combined. And I think most people will probably agree that if we are seeing a one issue, then it's possible that might be more hazards present that we haven't identified yet. So then looking at, okay, what is the control measure? What is the most appropriate control measure? So working through the hierarchy of controls, elimination, engineering controls. I mean, possibly PPE won't do much in terms of psychosocial risks. But looking at identifying the most appropriate measures, selecting control measures, implement, and then review, follow up. So looking at, okay, did they make a difference? Consulting with workers whether things have improved. Analyzing records and that. But as we do, near misses and incidents, time off, for example. So as I said, you have to consult with workers when identifying hazards, establish a mechanism for workers to report this. And also thinking of whether we are in our own workplace culture, whether we accept sort of harmful behaviors. It could be accepting name calling, teasing, sexualized or gender jokes, crude language. So in terms of duration, how long is the worker exposed to these hazards? How often does it happen? And how severe could they be? So next step. I would encourage you all to work through and familiarize yourself with SAFEWORK Australia's code of practice. So there is a code of practice called Managing Psychosocial Hazards of Work. It's been issued by SAFEWORK Australia. It will be adopted here in SA. So we will have one which says SAFEWORK SA and the code of practice. And the code of practice is not legally binding, but it sets out basically ways to address psychosocial hazards of work. So it gives you, a number of good suggestions, but also it's taken to be general knowledge. So if issues were to rise, it got reported to the SAFEWORK SA, they would look at what you have done. And if you've done nothing, that would be a problem because there's a code of practice which suggests a number of things to do. So it will be taken into account if there are enforcement action or proceedings. Once again, review your policies and procedures and looking at your safety systems are the ways to identify and capture and address psychosocial hazards. And work with the management team on this. Once again, happy for you to reach out to us, the members of SAWIA. Access our website for resources. You can always talk to myself or Ash directly. We're happy to once again come out and present, talk to you on the phone, review your policies, for example. But it's fair to say that yeah, things are changing when it comes to psychosocial and sort of psychological hazards and harm. clearly now we have a regulation, so it's much clearly more clearly spelled out what the expectations are, and that this is sort of a key risk to manage. And once again, not just in terms of compliance, but also in terms of the broader sort of work culture. If we have a workplace where people don't feel supported, where there are a number of sort of issues, then once again, impact on turnover, low productivity, performance, absenteeism, return to work claims, sort of personally, not a highly productive workplace to take all that into account. And equally, think of the potential reputational damage, and also looking at the ESG framework. What would our customers think? What would the retailers think if something went wrong? So what are we doing practically to ensure that we have a good workplace, a workplace where people feel supported and people want to come to work and work productively? It's the end of the presentation. So Ash and I are going to stay online for a bit longer, and very happy to take any questions. If you want to type them out directly into your Q&A or your chat, or if you want to reach out after the webinar and have a chat to us, always very happy to do that too. Ash, we haven't had any questions so far, have we?
Oh, no questions.
So with that, I do hope that you found the webinar useful. It is brief. I would suggest sort of in a workplace, we would need more time than an hour to get through these two areas, particularly if you're working with the workforce, particularly in relation to sexual harassment and some of those type of behaviors. Then you want to spend some more time to help them in identifying what sort of sexual harassment might look like. So there was a question from, how do you delineate poor performance from mental health and stress? That's a good question. I'm probably going to sort of, I'm going to be addressing it in two different ways. So firstly, as a manager, you are entitled to manage poor performance. You are entitled to give warnings. You're entitled to terminate someone for poor performance if you follow the appropriate process. And if you undertake reasonable management action in a reasonable manner, then that's perfectly fine. So in other words, if you do it professionally and appropriately, that is fine, and that wouldn't be like if someone says, well, they're getting stressed because they're being performance managed. That's understandable. That would be very stressful, but that in itself would not be viewed as being a safety issue, or indeed being accepted as a claim to return to work, let's say. Whereas if you decided to, and I'm not saying anyone is, but I'm just going to put it as an extreme example, if someone decided to, performance manage someone in front of their colleagues and tell their colleagues that this person is completely incompetent and stupid, yeah, that is not reasonable. Or decide to, terminate someone in front of the whole company and yell, "You're fired." Yeah, that's not reasonable, and that would probably be a major problem, not just in terms of, I guess, from a fair work perspective in terms of unfair dismissal claims, but also from a safety perspective. That wouldn't be deemed to be reasonable management action. So that's probably how I would do it, but also recognizing that if someone is if you see someone's performance dropping, then I think it's well worth asking yourself why, and have a conversation with the staff member, because we also know that if you are experiencing mental health conditions, whether it's anxiety or depression, or you might have things in your private life, obviously we take that into our workplace and they may well affect our performance. Having an open, honest conversation. I would also encourage businesses to look at mental health first aid training. I think that is a very practical training as a way of providing support to workers. And if employees don't want to go to the manager or supervisor and say that they are struggling because they might experience a mental health condition, or they might be having a really difficult time in their private lives, having a mental health first aider, I think is really useful to provide that sort of first aid and to be able to recommend and point out supports that are available. Also consider employee assistance programs. So in other words, external providers that employees can turn to for free counseling. It can be counseling over the phone, or it can be a couple of free counseling sessions. It can also be a really good way of supporting staff and helping them to address those issues which are affecting their performance. So having open honest conversations as a manager and supervisor, I think is really useful. So I hope that sort of broadly answered that question. I think that's probably it, Ash. So once again, thank you very much for attending. I hope you found it useful. Sadly, there will be probably more work for all of us involved going forward. But as I said, happy for you to reach out to Ashley and I to see how we can support you. So with that, thank you for your attendance today, and I wish you a good and successful day, and also a joyous and happy festive season and happy new year. Thank you, everyone.